I have the pleasure of introducing our next speaker, Karen Davis, who is the founder and president of United Poultry Concerns. And yes. And do you know that next year will be United Poultry Concerns' 30th year in existence? Amazing. Incredible. I mean, she started this organization back in 1990, telling people that she was going to start an organization for chickens, and people were like, what? And here we are, 30 years later, a thriving, wonderful organization that I am incredibly honored and proud to be part of, and you know, doing amazing work. Karen is tireless for the animals. She is passionate and compassionate for the chickens and for all animals, and I admire her and am in awe of her every day. So I'm so lucky to have her as a boss and a friend, and we're so glad she's here. And yay! So Karen Davis, PhD, is the founder and president of United Poultry Concerns, a national organization that promotes the compassionate and respectful treatment of domestic fowl, including the sanctuary for chickens in Virginia. We have a sanctuary on the eastern shore of Virginia with over 100 resident birds. We also have one of the only full aviaries of a sanctuary where it goes over the trees, so the birds are able to roost in the trees at night. They don't have to come into the coop. They are protected completely. It's very, very cool. She was elected into the National Animal Rights Hall of Fame for outstanding outstanding contributions to animal liberation. And Karen is the author of numerous books, including Prison Chickens, Poisoned Eggs, The Holocaust and the Handmaid's Tale, and other groundbreaking works revealing the plight of poultry and advancing conceptual and strategic approaches to effective farmed animal advocacy. Her books are available out on the table, in the UPC table right out there. And I'm just so honored and pleased to have you welcome Karen Davis. Yeah.
Once again, I thank everybody for being here today. It's such a great pleasure to be in your company and to have you here. And I'm so happy with all of our speakers and everybody. And I do have to say, we have to give a round of applause to Hope Bohannic, who just introduced me. Hope does a fantastic job in so many ways for United Poultry Concerns as our project manager, and she organizes this conference from every standpoint. So, I mean, I'm involved, but Hope really does all the nitty-gritty work and the overarching work and everything. So she's really just wonderful. So I'm honored to be associated with Hope and to have Hope as an important staff member of United Poultry Concerns. So the topic I'm addressing today is titled the quote, and of course I've got quotation marks around things to mean that it's not really what I mean, or that I'm being ironic in the use of some of these terms. But the title of my talk is The Ethics of Eviscerating Farmed Animals for, quote unquote, Better Welfare. And what I'm particularly focusing on in this presentation is an evisceration of the brains, the minds, the emotions of farmed animals for so-called better welfare. Now, most of you, I'm sure, know that the term evisceration refers to removing the intestines or the innards of a being, to eviscerate them, their viscera, to remove their viscera. And I'm looking at the idea of eviscerating the minds and brains of farmed animals for so-called better welfare. Now, my presentation does have something in common, I believe, with what we're going to be discussing this afternoon regarding clean meat or cellular meat, if you will, what I call, encompassing both what I'm discussing, the evisceration of live animals while they're alive to improve their welfare in horrible living conditions, and the idea of creating flesh, meat, that has the animal and the mind of the animal and everything presumably sentient about the animal deleted from the meat. So what I call all of this, the evisceration of live animals, the evisceration of the animal from the flesh, is sentience-free food. Can there be such a thing as sentience-free food? And if so, that is animal food, okay? Sentience-free animal food, including dairy, mammary gland products, and eggs. And is this necessarily a good or right thing to support, to do to these animals? So, could a brain-dead chicken matrix solve ethical issues of factory farming? This was an issue raised by the Huffington Post in 2012. And here's a researcher, actually a student researcher, Andre Ford, who is described as wanting to bring new meaning to the phrase, like a chicken with its head cut off. Andre Ford proposes his headless chicken solution for a product at the Royal College of Art, in which he was asked by industry to look for a sustainable solution to the United Kingdom's farming inefficiencies. Now, one thing that this project that he was asked to investigate is how the idea of the welfare of the animals is intricately connected in the industry parlance and purposes with increasing efficiency, making the animals more productive, making them produce their meat, milk, and eggs in a quicker amount of time with less food, since feeding animals is 70 to 75% of all the costs of raising an animal. So the industry is always looking for ways to raise larger animals with more muscle tissue, or birds who lay more eggs, or cows or goats who produce more mammary milk on less, what they call less feed, to reduce the cost, the food cost especially, of extracting these products from these animals, and thereby making the products in the retail sector, restaurants, food stores, etc., cheaper, and enabling people to buy more and more and more of that material. Various researchers and animal welfareists equate removing the brain, sensation, and body parts of farmed animals with the removal or reduction of suffering. The primary beneficiaries, quote unquote, of these so-called welfare experiments and bodily excisions are chickens. One thing that was brought out by Joanne Farb in her presentation that's so important for everybody to be aware of is the massive number of chickens, turkeys, ducks, goats, cows, pigs, and of course fish, water animals too, who are used in every type of experimental research. Not only in toxicology research, pharmaceutical research, basic research, medical research, etc. But animal agribusiness has its own vivisection component. And since a lot of what industry is interested in learning is how animals behave in flocks and herds, Many animals, like chickens, for example, will be used in a single debeaking experiment, or breeding featherless chickens and breeding chickens without various components, including their eyes. You can't even believe the things that go on behind the scenes, not just in the United States, but all over the planet. Debeaking has been represented by poultry researchers as a benefit to the birds in battery cages. Because, as one researcher, James V. Craig, once wrote, even though it might cause temporary pain to the individual bird, it is for the benefit of all the birds in the cage. Because that way, when they're driven crazy, because chickens evolved to use their beaks for foraging, for food, which they have an inborn need to do. And if they don't have anything to peck when they're in a cage or something like a cage, then they can be driven to peck each other because they have a need to peck, to pull at things, to pick at things. When they take dust baths, they rake in the dirt to clean themselves. So what are they going to do when they're just in a wire cage with nothing but each other, and the only thing that has any texture or pull to it is, sad to say, each other's bodies? So the idea is you debeak them, and then the blunt stump of the beak is supposed to cause less pain and suffering, but actually that isn't even true. But I won't even get into that topic. The industry tells its own story of every form of horror that is committed against these birds. The only difference is they're not bothered by it. They're not bothered a bit. They may be good people, but they're also, in my opinion, not good people. The traditional surgical removal of body parts of chickens and other farmed animals, such as debeaking, detowing, de-winging, dehorning, tail docking, castration, etc., is now being extended to include proposals for the genetic manipulation of farmed animal brains so that they will be born without a cerebral cortex, without the ability to feel or experience themselves in their surroundings. Now, this is a typical chicken house. Now, we live in Virginia, in one of the largest chicken-producing regions of the country and the world, the so-called Delmarva Peninsula, comprising all of Delaware, the eastern shore of Maryland, and the eastern shore of Virginia, where our sanctuary and our headquarters is located. At any given time, on the eastern shore, the mid-Atlantic states that I just mentioned, over 500 million chickens are in concentration camps. The huge what they call Tyson processing plants, which are slaughter plants, Tyson processing complex. You drive up the road and you see the steam coming out of it. You see all the cars in the parking lots. You see the truckloads and truckloads and truckloads all day and all night of chickens going into that horror after they lived like that, in total filth, crowding. The genetics imposed upon them makes it so they can barely stand on their legs, or even unable to stand on their legs, because they're in such pain, such hip joint pain, because their bodies grow so fast and so large in such a short amount of time that their skeletal system can't support their body weight. So those chicken legs people think are so good, those legs were racked with pain when they were still attached to the individual from whom they were extracted in the slaughter plant. So cognitive ethologist Leslie J. Rogers, who wrote a very important book about chickens called The Development of Brain and Behavior in the Chicken. In her book, Minds of Their Own, Thinking and Awareness in Animals, writes, in the industrial farming of today, the identities of individual animals are completely lost. Animals are intensively farmed animals in intensive farms are seen as bodies to be fattened or to lay eggs. Their higher cognitive abilities are ignored and definitely unwanted. And the picture that you see there, the illustration, is from a very interesting book by an English mathematician that he wrote for children, but really for people of all ages. He wrote the text and did all the illustrations, showing that, for example, how the industry created two different types of what they call utility chickens. And this was in the mid-20th century when so much of this research was going on, and still goes on. But to create a distinct type of chicken who lays huge numbers of eggs, a small, lithe little chicken who you can fit many of in a battery cage, versus chickens who are bred for putting on an increasing amount of breast muscle tissue, so that basically they're just considered a walking piece of breast muscle. And of course their body parts go all over the world, and people who eat chicken feet and everything else all over the world. My friend in Minneapolis, Minnesota, who runs Chicken Run Rescue, Mary Britton Klaus, took a cue from my book, The Holocaust and the Handmaid's Tale, a case for comparing atrocities, to create an image analogous to the idea of, what's her name, Margaret Atwood's book, The Handmaid's Tale. And so she created like all these like the eggs. That's all the hen is considered to be, just eggs. And she deliberately put the little cap and, I want to say cap and gown, well, you know, the handmaid's tales, or the handmaid's uniform, because the handmaid is considered only to be good as long as their ovaries are churning out eggs, and that's certainly true for hens. So she kind of just put she took this picture of her artwork and piled up all these eggs, but then she put the headdress and the uniform down there on the floor to suggest, where did the hen go? Did she go to slaughter? Is she finally liberated from this hellish egg, being an egg, considered what the industry calls an egg machine? Well, it's an artwork that poses as an enigma, and more than one. That's the Handmaid's Tale, as well as Handmaid's Tale. Beings who are considered, as all farmed animals are, they're not valued as whole beings. They're valued for one particular economic trait, and the rest of what they are and who they are is of no value at all, and is basically considered to be in the way, like a beak is in the way of keeping hens in battery cages. The beak doesn't fit the battery cage. The legs don't fit. The wings don't fit. The chicken's nature doesn't fit. The quote-unquote unwanted cognitive abilities of chickens and other farmed animals is a basis for laboratory experiments on these animals all over the world. The notion that farmed animals would benefit from the genetic destruction of their minds, emotions, and sensations has prompted proposals such as, well, Andre Ford, who I introduced this discussion by showing a picture of what he envisioned for the better welfare for chickens and more efficiency and all that. But here's another student, graduate student, Jonathan Latimer. In 2018, he won a University of Oxford prize for his proposal in practical ethics titled Why We Should Genetically Disenhance Animals Used in Factory Farms. In other words, eviscerate their brains for their better welfare. Latimer writes, disenhancement is a genetic modification that removes the animal's capacity to feel pain. Scientists hope to be able to do this without inflicting any pain at all. Can you imagine the kinds of experiments that would have to go on to eliminate an animal's ability to feel pain and say, well, this is just a sort of snap. You know, you just kind of do this, won't inflict any pain on the animals. I mean, did you ever hear such crap? But they're serious, you know. The argument that Latimer and those who shared his point of view make is that disenhancement promises to reduce suffering in factory-farmed animals by removing their capacity to feel pain by their terrible, caused by their terrible environment, and will significantly increase the quality of life for animals in factory farms. Now, I mean, just talking in terms of increasing the quality of life for somebody in a concentration camp. Well, if we just remove their brains, we'll increase their quality of life. Or if we remove their beaks, or their wings, or their arms, or their legs. This is how flippant and facile these kinds of people are. And yet they're taken seriously by many who are desperate, and to give the benefit of the doubt to at least some of these many, who are desperate for animals to not have to suffer, since, quote unquote, they're going to be used anyway. We hear that a lot. Now, what I'm saying here is that suffering, the term suffering, the experience of suffering, involves more than a conscious sensation of pain. Suffering refers to a wound, injury, trauma, or harm sustained by a sentient individual, whether or not the individual experiences the wound or harm or pain per se. Like, you might have a tumor growing inside you and you don't even know it. You're suffering, but you don't know it. And there are many examples of suffering. Many. The sickness unto death that Soren Kierkegaard, the theologian, talked about. One of the attributes of the sickness unto death, which is his term for despair, is that people who are in despair in the form of the suffering or the sickness unto death don't know they're in despair. So suffering refers to a trauma or an injury, whether you feel it or not. You have suffering inside you, in your mind or in your body or both. Therefore, I'm saying, destroying a creature's brain, nervous system, and other mind and body parts necessarily inflicts suffering on that creature. Most people hoping for a genetic solution to the suffering of animals on factory farms have no idea of what really goes on in genetic engineering laboratories, where countless billions of chickens, quails, turkeys, all kinds of birds, again, because birds are so small, they're just used in just numbers that you can't even fathom, but other types of farmed animals too, are modified, tinkered with, and trashed by researchers routinely without a shred of conscience or compassion. And I'll just give you one of many examples I could give. In 1994, I attended the first international conference on the artificial insemination of poultry at the University of Maryland in College Park, Maryland. And again, you have to be there to understand the complete consciencelessness, even the jokes that are made about what these people are doing to these animals, that they think it's funny. I mean, we may say, well, ultimately they're good people and they're just doing what everybody else is doing or something, but there's a reason that some people go into those kinds of businesses and stay there, and others get a little taste of it, maybe as an undergraduate, and say, no way, this is not for me. So, for example, one of the speakers from the University of Guelph in Ontario, he gave a talk about freezing, masturbating roosters and freezing their semen, and something to do with creating mixed species, which they call chimeras. And then somebody asked the question, well, what do you do with them if they don't express the genetic alteration that you want them to exhibit? And he just laughed and said, oh, well, we throw them away. So, and that's their attitude. That's their attitude. They're just flippant and heartless and without a grain of remorse. If they feel remorse deep inside, that just doesn't count because it's not showing in their lives, in their work, in their attitude, in their behavior. So it doesn't count. Ethically, genetic engineering is not a solution to the suffering of animals on factory farms. In fact, it is an extension of the system and mentality that produced and produces such suffering in the first place. This is a so-called spent hen slaughter plant, one of many. This is where the hens who are who are not laying enough eggs to be considered profitable anymore. This is where they go. Don't ever think that eggs are an innocent product. They are the opposite of an innocent product. So this is a spent hen plant. After these hens sat in battery cages or in so-called cage-free operations, they end up here, or they get gassed in metal boxes where they're slowly strangled and suffocated in great pain with carbon dioxide. So that's the egg industry. Suko, my friend and colleague and one of the famous artists of all kinds of social justice issues, I assume most of you have heard of Suko, and her social justice absolutely includes the plight of other than human animals at our mercy. And she's done huge, amazing portraits of farmed animals, actually going into the slaughterhouses with her sketchbook and sketching the animals and sketching the situations in which they're in. I mean, she's a very courageous, ethically courageous person and very productive in what she finally produces. So decompression of chickens, as opposed to subjecting them to paralytic electric shocks, is considered a possible welfare alternative to the use of the electric shocks. And this kind of research is going on all the time. It's putting these poor birds in these chambers and then removing all the oxygen from the chamber. And this is touted as humane. But if you did any research on it, you'd see it's ghastly, okay? It's all ghastly. There's no way out. So when I did a report on decompression then, I asked Sue if she could illustrate it, and she did. That was her illustration of the part of it is just looking at the madness of it, She captures just the madness of what we're doing. The horror, the madness, the cruelty, the craziness of it. And yet it's taken this is perfectly normal, perfectly okay. Jonathan Latimer, his proposal for disenhancing farmed animals, their brains, cutting out their brains either surgically or genetically or both, is an extension of philosopher Peter Singer's so-called practical ethics. Now, many people have very favorable ideas of Peter Singer. He's considered the so-called father of animal liberation because he did write an important book and published an important book in 1975, Animal Liberation, which certainly was very instrumental in launching the modern animal advocacy movement in England and in the United States. However, there's a dark side to Peter Singer, very dark. And he has not always been a friend to animals in his discourse, both written and oral. And he has been worst of all in his treatment, in his talks about chickens. He's been very mean. So, in Singer's view, genetic engineering of wingless chickens would be a quote-unquote welfare advantage if it would give them more room in the battery cages. He told the publication Slate in 2006, if you could eliminate various other chicken instincts, like its, notice he doesn't say her, he says its, like it's a thing, an object, like its preference for laying eggs in a nest, that would be an improvement too. And asked if he would consider it ethical to engineer a brainless bird grown strictly for meat, Singer said he would consider it, quote, an ethical improvement on the present system because it would eliminate the suffering these birds are feeling. Well, again, to talk in such a facile manner about removing body parts and mental parts of an animal as if they were just objects that you just take this piece away and that piece away, and that improves their quality of life in hell, that somehow has something to do with being ethical or compassionate or empathic or anything. So this image here, again, another one from Nigel Burrows, whose book Chicken, about chickens, is just so, he's got these marvelous illustrations that we make good use of, I think. But that's kind of like what, is that a good thing to shoot for there, that picture like that? And I mean in real life, translating that into real life. So I ask, for example, consider, do you believe that the wings of a bird are mere physical, expendable appendages that can be lopped off like a table leg? Is the beak or brain of a bird a mechanical component like an auto part? Now, I'll just mention very briefly, some of you have heard of the researcher who I've quoted frequently, both in writing and speaking, Eldon Kienholz at Colorado State University. He was a poultry scientist there. He died a number of years ago, but not before I got to know him, and not before he finally resigned for his tenure, his full professorial tenure, rather than continue to do experiments that he was required to do as a poultry scientist in order to retain his tenure and his place in the university. And what he and colleagues did was they got grants to remove the wings and the tails of baby chickens and turkeys to see if by doing that they could save feed costs that wouldn't be necessary to actually have to be used to create tails and wings. And he said it was when he began to see these birds unable to get back on their feet if they fell over, that they would just roll around on their backs because without their wings they couldn't get themselves back up again. And he said that made him start to think about, what am I doing? What is this? And he began to, as I say, that began a thought process of his that ultimately led him to resign, to retire early rather than continue to do the kind of work. And he did other horrible things too. But that was something. So another point to make is where Peter Singer says, makes this glib comment about, if being wingless would provide more room in the battery cage, being wingless, a chicken, a hen. Well, first of all, okay, if the hen falls over on her back, who the heck is going to help her get upright again? Anybody who's ever seen the conditions of hens in battery cages sees what happens to them with their wings. And of course, the industry would just fill up the space with more chickens. Isn't that obvious? Why are we hearing people who are supposed to be very highly educated people and influential saying these silly, heartless things? So we need to be very attentive to what so-called animal welfareists are actually promoting and what kind of relationship they really seem to have to the victims of our species. This is me in Florence up there at our place in Machipongo, Virginia, in our sanctuary. It just so happened that the journalist from the Virginian Pilot, when he was taking a bunch of pictures for a front page article at Thanksgiving that year, Florence just happened to raise her wings up and he got that picture. And I was just so happy with it. And of course, we've shown it many times. It's just, there she was, Florence. She lived happily with us for 7 years, even though she was, of course, bred to be slaughtered for Thanksgiving. But she was a wonderful bird, and there she is, and she was my friend, and I was just so happy I got to know her and be with her for 7 years. Scientists cite neurological evidence that the amputated stump of a de-beaked bird is experienced by the bird as, quote unquote, similar to what happens in human amputees who suffer from phantom limb pain. So tons of experiments have been done debeaking chickens and quails and turkeys, and then documenting how long the pain appears to last. I mean, everything. I mean, this goes on all the time. This is institutionalized animal abuse. It just goes on, whether it's, as Joanne said, whether it's of any value or not. It's just an institutionalized thing that certain types of people go into and seem comfortable enough to, or even thrive in and within their own, little discipline bubble or whatever it is. So those are chickens, hens who have been debeaked as babies in the kind of place that Joanne described, a hatchery. That's where they now call these debeaking rooms servicing rooms. That's where they service the birds. They always euphemize the language as they go on. You know, forced molting is now a laying pause. You know, they keep euphemizing the language. Scientists cite behavioral evidence for the persistence in factory farm chickens of what they call ancestral memories of their natural endowments and the tropical forest beginnings. That's where they evolved. They're basically tropical forest dwellers, chickens are. Even if all they ever experienced in their own personal lives was a wire cage or a manure-covered confinement facility or floor. Those of us who run sanctuaries can bear witness to the persistence of these memories. We can take chickens who have never been in a cage, out of a cage in their life, and carefully set them on the ground, and almost invariably, the first activity, once they kind of get over their bewilderment, they've never been on the ground, on solid earth before, is they start to make the scratching and the beak gestures of taking a dust bath, which for a chicken is comparable to our taking a water bath. They have such an inborn need to practice hygiene, and they recognize the earth as the material in which to take a dust bath. They have those ancestral memories inside themselves. And this is a picture of some of our hens here. We remember how to run free after a life in cages. Believe me, it doesn't take them long to recognize an environment that makes sense to them as chickens. The fresh air, the trees, the grass, the ground, each other, not just being like on top of each other practically every day, all day without escape, but actually space around themselves, and they can still socialize and be chickens. What if these deeply structured memory formations and networks of ancestral knowledge in the bodies and brains of factory-farmed birds give rise to what I call phantom limbic memories in the living bird? In other words, you take away their brain and their other body parts, but the memories somehow persist. Because work has been done by Oliver Sacks and other researchers who point out how when every other almost brain function in some human beings has been somehow compromised, is gone, they have memories of music and harmonies and things that, like, where are these things even located? Or how do they have those kinds of memories, that memory retention? So we're talking about very profound and obscure things going on in the biology of a bird, every bit as much as in the biology of a human, in the neurophysiology, in the being and the beingness of a bird and of all animals, of whom we are one kind. What if there are embodied experiences so integral to the very being of a chicken or other animal that even dismembered or mutilated brain and body parts possess a memory of who he or she really is? Do we consider it ethical to disenhance the very being of a bird or any animal as a welfare measure purporting to reduce or eliminate the physical pain inflicted or encountered on the farm? In considering this question, we have to recall that the sensation of pain is only one form of suffering that, in being consciously experienced, can cause agony and distress to an individual. Think, for example, of types of agony and suffering that aren't technically pain, but are agony and suffering, felt suffering. Think, for example, of chronic fear. It's not exactly pain, but it's a horrible feeling, and it's totally debilitating over time. Claustrophobia, persistent itching. Have you ever heard of people who have an itch deep in their brain that they can't get rid of? That even surgery can't locate? Well, there are such people. They can never scratch enough. All they do is wound their heads because they can't get rid of that itch. And it can't be located exactly. So think perhaps, again, of these different types of horrible experiences that don't necessarily entail pain per se, technical pain. Persistent itching, the sensation of being unable to breathe, which is one of the worst feelings in the world. Slow asphyxiation, slow strangulation, trying to take breaths and not being able to take a breath. Sleeplessness, and many other examples of suffering that, even if not technically painful, may be as bad as, if not worse than, certain kinds of pain. Finally, do you perceive a moral difference, this leads us into our afternoon session, between genetically disenhancing the minds of live animals to fit them to industrial farming conditions versus manufacturing sentience-free flesh for human consumption, i.e. cellular meat or clean meat or any of the names that are constantly, or right now at least, being applied to the sentience-free flesh that is grown in a laboratory type of setting. So there's a picture of, there's, Suko did another picture for me that I asked her to do of hens who are in a cage-free environment, and they're still miserable. They're not in a cage, but they're going, ah! And you might say that's like, I asked her to do a version of the hen screaming based on Edvard Munch's famous set of paintings called The Scream in Nature. So that's the hen, that's her scream. So there I am with some of our chickens at our sanctuary in Machipongo, Virginia. It's just a little tiny place, but again, in one of the biggest chicken-producing regions of the country. And again, we're not just talking about a region that services those states or this country. When I first visited a chicken slaughter plant, Tyson Chicken Slaughter Plant in Richmond, Virginia, back around 1991 or 1992, we started at the end and worked our way up to the loading dock. And at the end, there were all these huge, boxes with Russian writing on them of, chicken parts that were going to Russia. So, Tyson and Purdue and all these companies, they have investments all over the planet. They're everywhere. They're everywhere. And these products that derive from places like Maryland or Virginia or Delaware, they're going all over the earth, all the time. And live animals there are special airport sections in the airports where they are surreptitiously taking cows and pigs and chickens, live animals, pigs, chickens, horses, for experimentation all the time. This is my new book that's going to be coming out very soon, titled For the Birds, From Exploitation to Liberation. It's a volume of many of my essays, which I hope you'll all buy a copy of. It's not here yet, but it'll be out in a couple months, a month or two. And then books I've already written and published, some of which, maybe all of which, are out on our table outside. More Than a Meal, The Turkey in History, Myth, Ritual, and Reality. The Holocaust and the Handmaid's Tale, A Case for Comparing Atrocities. My cookbook, Instead of Chicken, Instead of Turkey, A Poultryless Poultry Potpourri, totally vegan, of course. And Prisoned Chickens, Poisoned Eggs, an inside look at the modern poultry industry. And so that's it.